What makes an ordinary teenager a hero? Once upon a time, people thought it took special qualities or training. But the story you're about to hear will prove that sometimes all it takes is boundless love and a cool head in life's worst moment. In the heart of Idaho lies one of the wildest and most untamed areas in the United States, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Spanning more than 2.3 million acres, this vast preserve is an adventurer's paradise. Here, among steep mountains and deep canyons, nature has preserved its pristine appearance, untouched by modern civilization. A special place in this wilderness is occupied by the Bighorn Crags, a majestic array of granite peaks soaring into the sky with sharp spires and impregnable walls. These crags, towering above alpine lakes and narrow gorges, have long beckoned climbers. But unlike popular routes, where every meter has been explored and described in guidebooks, there were still untouched walls waiting for their pioneers. August 2015 was typically hot in these parts. The sun was scorching mercilessly, forcing the granite to heat up during the day and cool down sharply at night. In such weather, the rocks became especially treacherous. Seemingly solid stones could suddenly flake off and tear down, taking with them everything in their path. Even experienced climbers knew not to let their guard down for a second. 13 miles from the nearest sign of civilization, Ship Island Lake lay at the foot of these majestic cliffs. Its calm waters reflected the granite towers of Bighorn Crags, giving a deceptive impression of serenity. But this wilderness was preparing a serious test for the two climbers who had set up camp here. A test that would test not only their skills and experience, but also their will to live. For 13-year-old Charlie Finlayson, the mountains have been a second home since he was a child. His father, David, an accomplished mountaineer and lawyer from Salt Lake City, took his son on trips from the snowy peaks of Canada to the tropical jungles of Panama from infancy. This approach to upbringing was not accidental. David purposefully prepared in Charlie a reliable partner for future climbs. After his parents divorced, Charlie lived mostly with his mother and stepfather, but summers were always a time of special adventures with his father. By the age of 13, he had already amassed an impressive amount of experience climbing on local crags around Salt Lake City. However, in the summer of 2015, Charlie wanted more. More challenging and technical routes beckoned to him. On August 11, 2015, father and son loaded up their backpacks with 45 pounds of gear and set off on a 2-week expedition into the heart of the Frank Church Wilderness. Their rucksacks were packed with everything they needed: ropes, carabiners, safety gear, a tent, food and water, everything they would need for an autonomous stay in the mountains. The plan was ambitious. They didn't just want to take existing routes, but to blaze new lines of climbing on the pristine walls of the Bighorn Crags. A 4-day arduous trek through the wilderness led them to Ship Island Lake. They hiked several miles each day, trudging through dense forests and steep slopes with heavy backpacks over their shoulders. Finally, exhausted but enthusiastic, they set up base camp at the lake, just off the main tourist area, close to the majestic walls of Bighorn Crags. From here they had a spectacular view of the granite towers, which seemed to magnetically attract the eyes of both climbers. Unlike popular climbing areas, there were no beaten paths or marked routes, just wild, untouched walls over 300 meters high. Every morning they woke up at first light and set out to explore, climbing huge boulders and overcoming steep scree. They weren't just looking for a route to climb, they were looking for a path of their own that no one had ever traveled before. Their outing together was not just a hike, it was a time of special bonding between father and son, when every step, every decision required complete trust in each other. But neither of them could have guessed how serious a test of that trust the next few days would be. After several days of careful reconnaissance of the terrain, a particular line of ascent caught their attention. 2 majestic granite peaks towering above the surrounding landscape, like ancient sentinels. This route, which they named Twin Towers, seemed like the perfect challenge. challenging enough to be interesting, but not so dangerous as to put 13-year-old Charlie at undue risk. Each evening, sitting outside their tent and looking up at those cliffs, they discussed the upcoming climb in detail. David drew on his vast experience to explain to his son the technical aspects of the route. They planned to start early in the morning while the sun was still warming the rocks, making them more dangerous due to possible rockfall. On August 17th, with the stars still twinkling in the pre-dawn sky, the usual morning routine had already begun at their small camp at Ship Island Lake. David was preparing a light breakfast while Charlie methodically laid out the gear on the tarp in front of the tent. Each item required special attention. Here, 13 miles from civilization, any malfunction could be fatal. The dynamic rope, their main safety net, was carefully coiled and checked for scuffs. The carabiners were checked one by one for smooth latch operation. The slightest jam could cost precious seconds on the route. Charlie checked his grigri harness especially carefully. This small, automatic locking mechanism was their last line of defense in the event of a fall. He disassembled and reassembled it, checking the operation of each part as his father had taught him many times before. The first rays of sunlight caught them as they approached the start of the trail. Ahead towered an imposing granite wall some 365 meters high. David and Charlie were the only climbers in the area. The wilderness seemed to hold its breath as they watched father and son prepare for their most serious adventure together. Neither of them could have guessed that in a few hours this beautiful summer day would turn into a brutal ordeal that would change their lives forever. The first rays of the sun were already beginning to warm the granite walls of Twin Towers as David and Charlie approached the start of the trail. Before them stood a massive wall more than 365 meters high, an impressive challenge even for experienced climbers. David checked the knots on his own and his son's harnesses one more time, although he knew Charlie was capable of doing it himself. This fatherly habit of double-checking everything personally brought a slight smile to the boy's face. The first pitch began with a wide crack, gradually narrowing toward the top, the perfect terrain for warming up and testing readiness for the more serious sections. David confidently led the way, methodically working his way up and setting up safety points every few meters. His hands habitually found secure hooks, while his feet probed each footing before shifting their weight. Charlie watched the movement of the rope carefully through his grigri, giving it out smoothly as his father advanced. This automatic safety device was more reliable than the classic figure eight. It would instantly lock the rope in the event of a trip. Their actions had been honed over many climbs together. When David asked for more rope, Charlie knew exactly how much to give, and the distinctive sound of the next belay point telling him that his father had found a secure anchor point. Gradually they gained altitude. Pitch by pitch, meter by meter, the wall yielded to their persistence. The sun rose higher and higher, and with it the nature of the climb changed. The terrain became more difficult, requiring more concentration and technical skill. Charlie was doing his job as insurance man with confidence, which filled David with pride. His son had indeed become a reliable partner. By mid-afternoon, they had already climbed about 10 pitches, reaching about 365 meters above the ground. The view from here was spectacular. The vast sea of Frank Church wilderness stretched to the horizon. Ship Island Lake below became a small mirror surrounded by a dark green carpet of forest. At this altitude, every gust of wind was a reminder of how high they were from the ground. David began a horizontal movement along the wall to the next point of insurance. This section was relatively easy. A wide stone ledge, like a natural balcony, allowed for full-height movement. At this height, even simple movements required extreme concentration. Any mistake could cost lives. Charlie, securely fastened to his station by a tree growing out of the rock, watched his father's movements carefully. The rope slid smoothly through the safety device, measuring each step. By now, the summer sun had warmed the rocks thoroughly. In the mountains, this is always a tricky time of day for climbers. Heated rocks become less stable, and the dry air increases the effects of expansion in microcracks. But for the experienced David, such conditions were familiar. He was methodically moving to the next point when the echo among the rocks suddenly spread a sound that would make any climber's blood run cold. At that moment, David was moving slowly along a wide rock ledge. He was about 15 meters away from Charlie when through the mountain silence he heard the sound that every climber dreads to hear the most, the deafening crack of splintering rock somewhere above. David looked up in time to see a huge block of granite rock detached from the main wall directly above him. A block of rock, the size of a small automobile, snapped downward. "Rock!" David shouted as he tried to move out of the way, but the boulder hit the part of the wall he was standing on. Charlie, guarding his father from a secure position by the tree, watched in horror as the falling boulder knocked his father off the wall. David didn't just fall off. The massive chunk of rock literally swept him off the ledge, dragging him along the wall. Grigory's automatic safety device went off instantly, blocking the rope. Realizing that the violent jerk of the fall was about to follow, Charlie clutched the device tightly to himself, preparing for the worst. It all happened in a matter of seconds. As the cloud of stone dust began to settle, David hung motionless, 15 meters below Charlie. A long trail of blood stood out eerily on the gray granite of the wall, where the body had been dragged across the stone. "Daddy! Daddy!" Charlie's desperate cry echoed between the rocks, but there was only deafening silence in response. Fear gripped his entire body, but years of training with his father had not gone to waste. Even though he was only 13, Charlie knew this was no time to panic. Every second counted. He quickly checked the safety of his belay station, made sure the rope was intact, and began to slowly release it through Grigory to lower the backpack and first aid kit to his father. Several agonizing minutes passed before a faint moan came from below. David began to regain consciousness, and the first thing he saw was his own blood on the rock. His left arm was completely shattered from elbow to wrist. The leg below the knee seemed almost torn off with bones sticking out. Breathing was difficult. His ribs were probably broken. The helmet that had saved his life was cracked, and the left side of his face was riddled with shards of rock. Charlie felt a rush of relief when he heard his father's voice, but realized that this was only the beginning of the struggle for survival. They were more than 300 meters above the ground, 13 miles from the nearest civilization, and David's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Blood continued to ooze from his many wounds, and the day was inexorably slipping towards evening. "Charlie," David's voice was barely audible. "We have to get down. I'll give you a hand. You've got to manage." The day was slowly winding down, and David and Charlie were still high on the wall. The descent was going to be difficult, more than 300 meters vertically, and every meter could be fatal. David's eyes were periodically dark with blood loss, but he knew they had to act quickly before it got dark. "Listen carefully." David's voice was weak but confident. "You know how to organize the trigger system. We've practiced it hundreds of times. Descend me first, then descend yourself. Find secure points to anchor the rope." Charlie had never organized a rappel by himself before. Usually his father had done it, but now there was no choice. With shaking hands, he began to prepare the first rappel station. He checked every knot, every carabiner several times. He had no right to make a mistake. The most difficult thing was to lower his father's almost lifeless body. David tried to help with his healthy hand, pushing off the rock, but every movement caused him unbearable pain. Charlie slowly fed the rope through the rappel device, watching carefully to make sure his father didn't sway or hit the ledges. Pitch by pitch, they slowly approached the ground. At each station, Charlie had to reorganize the descent system. Sweat poured into his eyes and his hands trembled with exertion, but he did not allow himself to think of fatigue. On about the 8th descent, the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, plunging the valley into a cold twilight. By the time they reached the base of the wall, it was almost dark, but their ordeal was just beginning. Between them and the camp lay a mile and a half of rocky field, huge boulders, some the size of trucks, piled on top of each other, creating a veritable maze. "Charlie," David could barely speak, "you should go to camp. Bring some sleeping bags. And more bandages." "Yeah, I'll wait here." But Charlie couldn't bring himself to leave his father alone in this condition. David's broken arm needed attention. The sharp edges of the shattered bones could damage arteries. As carefully as possible, Charlie applied a tight bandage from elbow to wrist, trying to provide some stability to the injured limb. After a brief argument, they decided that they would spend the night right here at the foot of the wall. In total darkness, among the cold stones, Charlie made his father as comfortable a position as he could. Despite their efforts, David was still bleeding, shivering, the first signs of impending hypothermia. With no sleeping bags, just the clothes they were wearing, father and son prepared for the longest night of their lives. Darkness shrouded the mountains and the stars lit up over their heads. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, reminding them of how alone they were in this wilderness. Charlie stayed awake, constantly checking his father's pulse and trying to warm him with his body. Every hour seemed like an eternity, and dawn was still so far away. The first rays of the sun on August 18th illuminated an eerie scene at the foot of Twin Towers. David, exhausted by pain and blood loss, realized that he himself would not be able to walk the 1.5 kilometers of Stonefield to the camp. Every movement was unbearably painful, and his shattered limbs refused to support him. "Charlie," David mustered the last of his strength to speak clearly, "you must go for help. I have no chance of getting to the camp on my own." There was no point in arguing this time. Both of them realized that it was the only way to escape. Charlie checked his father's bandages again before he left, making sure the tourniquet was secure. His backpack contained everything he needed for the long journey: a map with his father's location marked on it, some food, water, and a filter to clean it. The goodbye was hard. Both realized it might be the last time they would see each other. At 8:15 a.m., Charlie began his journey. Walking along the familiar trail, he prayed that he would meet someone. They weren't supposed to be expected home until a week later. No one had even realized they were in trouble. After several miles of grueling climb out of the valley of Ship Island Lake, he heard what seemed like a miracle: human voices. Following the sound of voices, Charlie ran out into a small clearing where he saw two hikers, a father and son Craig, who were packing up their camp. Gasping from the rapid climb and the excitement, he held out to them a crumpled page from the guidebook with a note he had written the day before, at David's dictation. "This is my son Charlie. I was injured in a fall. We are on the southwest shore of Ship Island Lake. Please help him." The Craigs momentarily left their business. While his son pulled out the map, his father peppered Charlie with questions about David's condition and exact location. With trembling hands, Charlie unfolded his map, showing exactly where his father had stayed. The Craigs looked at each other and made a quick decision. They would go to David to administer first aid and not leave him alone. "Listen," the older Craig put his hand on Charlie's shoulder. "There's a Boy Scout camp about 2 miles from here by the next lake. There should be a team leader there with a radio. We'll take care of your father, and you run over there and try to organize a rescue operation." The plan seemed perfect. Charlie handed the Craigs some of his medical supplies and explained in detail how to find his father among the pile of boulders. It was a great relief to know that David would no longer be alone. With renewed strength and hope, Charlie hurried toward the scout camp. But when, after half an hour's rapid progress, he reached the place he had been directed to, he was sorely disappointed to find it empty. The tents were already folded up, the fire pit trampled, the scouts gone, perhaps only a few hours before. Despair began to roll in waves. Charlie stood on the lake shore, realizing that every minute lost was diminishing his father's chances of survival. Then, obeying some inner voice, he pulled out his rescue whistle. 3 shrill blasts broke the mountain silence. The sound of the whistle echoed off the surrounding mountains. Charlie blew it for almost 5 minutes, even though there was not a soul in sight. It seemed pointless, but something kept him going. Suddenly, a man came running out of the woods, a hiker who had camped with his family at a hidden lake nearby. After hearing Charlie's story, the man, who turned out to be an experienced marathon runner, made an instant decision. He would run to the ranger station, 8 miles up the mountain trail, to organize a rescue mission. His athletic training could minimize the travel time to a minimum. Charlie was to follow, but already at his own pace. It was well past noon by the time Charlie, barely able to stay on his feet after the grueling journey, reached the ranger station. The marathon runner had arrived hours before him, and the rangers had immediately set the rescue protocol in motion. The station was bustling with activity. The rangers had set up a field command post, laid out maps of the area, and coordinated the rescue teams by radio. Experienced service members already knew the situation was critical. A man with multiple injuries, including open fractures, was deep in the wilderness where there were no roads, and evacuation on foot could take too long. Operation management made the only right decision: to use aviation. A rescue helicopter was dispatched to Ship Island Lake as soon as the coordinates were received. At the same time, a ground rescue team was activated in case weather conditions prevented the helicopter from landing in the mountains. While waiting for news, the rangers carefully tended to the exhausted Charlie. They fed him a hot cheese sandwich, gave him a chance to rest, and kept him informed. One of the rangers contacted Charlie's stepfather, who was already on his way to pick him up. Meanwhile, at the foot of Twin Towers, crucial events were unfolding. The Craigs didn't just stay with David. They helped prepare the site for a possible helicopter landing by clearing a small space among the boulders. David, despite his critical condition and constant blood loss, remained conscious, thanks in large part to constant support and conversations with his unexpected rescuers. When the growing rumble of propellers was finally heard in the sky, everyone raised their heads. The rescue helicopter made several circles over the scene, assessing the possibility of landing in the difficult mountainous terrain. The pilot's professionalism made it possible to perform this difficult maneuver. The machine landed carefully on a tiny patch of rocky chaos. A group of rescuers with stretchers and medical equipment jumped out of the helicopter. They quickly examined David's injuries, stabilized his condition with additional tourniquets and bandages, and administered painkillers. Every movement during transportation could aggravate his injuries, so they had to act with extreme caution. The severity of David's injuries required staged treatment. He was first taken to Salmon City Hospital, where he was given emergency stabilization, and bleeding was stopped. However, local doctors quickly realized the injuries were so severe that specialized care was required. The patient was transported to Boise, where they performed primary surgical wound care and temporary fixation of the fractures. But the real struggle to recover began at IMC Medical Center in Salt Lake City. Here, David became part of an innovative program to reconstruct complex limb injuries. The main problem was his left leg. A rock impact had virtually destroyed the soft tissue of his tibia, leaving an open fracture with extensive loss of muscle mass. IMC doctors came up with a revolutionary approach. Instead of the traditional transplant of the patient's own tissue, they used specially treated bovine tissue combined with stem cells. This bioengineered construct served as a framework on which new blood vessels and muscle fibers could form. An external metal framework known as the Elizarov apparatus fixed the bones in the correct position while tissue regeneration took place. This device, similar to an external scaffold, consisted of metal rings connected by rods that passed through the bone. This design allowed doctors to precisely control the position of the bone fragments and gradually adjust their position as they healed. In parallel, work was underway to repair the left arm, which had been shattered from the elbow to the hand. Here, titanium plates and screws were used to fix multiple fractures, and reconstruction of damaged ligaments and tendons was carried out. David underwent about 10-12 surgeries in 6 months. Each of them was aimed at solving a certain problem: bone tissue restoration, muscle reconstruction, restoration of blood supply. Between surgeries, Intensive physical therapy courses were conducted to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain joint mobility. The story of David Finlayson's rescue by his 13-year-old son quickly made national news. Journalists tried to interview Charlie, calling him a hero, but he modestly replied that anyone would have done the same in his place. His parents, however, were of a different opinion. They knew that not every teenager can act so collected and decisive in a critical situation. This experience was a turning point in the father-son relationship. Before the accident, Charlie had often felt like he was split between two lives, the ordinary one with his mom and stepdad, and the adventurous one with his dad. But now something was different. In those terrifying hours at Twin Towers, they saw each other in a whole new light, not just as father and son, but as two people willing to fight for each other's lives to the end. Contrary to the expectations of those around him, the experience didn't scare Charlie away from the mountains. On the contrary, he felt more confident. Now he knew for sure that in a critical situation he could think clearly and act decisively. Moreover, the events of that day had shown him that he and his father could trust each other completely in any situation. For David, the accident was the impetus for a radical change. Leaving behind a career as a lawyer, he chose the life he had always dreamed of, free, filled with travel and new experiences. After selling his cabin in the mountains, he began traveling the country without being tied to one place. Guitar and meditation became his new companions, while rock climbing remained an integral part of his life. Today, years later, Charlie is a student at Brigham Young University, but he and his father still find time to climb together. What binds them together is more than just a love of the mountains, a shared experience that taught them to appreciate every moment of life and to trust each other unconditionally. Their story was a testament to the fact that the strongest bond between people can be born in the worst of trials. In the mountains of Idaho, somewhere on the slopes of Twin Towers, you can still find traces of their epic fight for life. But the true monument to those events is not the rock, but the unbreakable bond between father and son, forged in the crucible of adversity and only growing stronger. Charlie and David Finlayson's story makes you think about a lot of things. What makes a 13-year-old capable of acting coolly and decisively in a situation where even adults might panic? Perhaps it's the special upbringing David has given his son, years of preparing him for life in the mountains. Or maybe it's about those invisible bonds between father and son that only manifest themselves at the moment of mortal danger. This story also raises an important question about risk in mountaineering. Is it worth exposing yourself and your loved ones to such danger? But perhaps it is these moments on the edge of human possibility that allow us to truly know ourselves and those around us. What would you do if you were Charlie? Would you be able to stay calm and act methodically when the life of a loved one hangs in the balance? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're very interested to hear what you think. If you like this story about the strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable bond between father and son, support our channel by liking and subscribing. There are many more exciting stories of survival in the most extreme situations ahead of you. In the meantime, take care of yourself and your loved ones. And remember, the real strength of a person is measured not in the ability to avoid tests, but in the ability to pass through them, remaining human. See you in the next issues.